Hello there, everybody. Just wanted to create a quick video for you guys to kind of explain how we're changing gears within our civil rights movement unit. So far we've been talking about the history of segregation and the fight against it that kind of ended with the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, which ruled that segregation in public schools was no longer constitutional. And so we're going to changing gears and we're going to focus on the Little Rock Nine and school integration. So once the Brown ruling came from the Supreme Court, it was mandatory for all schools, public schools across the United States, to integrate, meaning to not have segregation anymore. So there could no longer be just black schools and just white schools. And this process happens all over the country in many different cities and towns and states. But we're going to focus on the Little Rock Nine because they're an excellent example of how school integration became a big battle between the state governments and the national or federal government after the Brown decision. And this is all an excellent example of something called federalism. So I want you to keep this term federalism in the back of your mind this week and for the next couple weeks. Federalism is the division of power between the state and the national or federal government. So I want you to imagine it being like a game of tug of war between the states. So imagine on one side you have the states, and on the other side you have the national government, and they're arguing about who has the most power, because the Constitution did divide these powers so that not either the national government or the state governments would be too powerful. This is something that we talked about first semester, and you guys reviewed federalism a little bit in the first week of NTI. So just keep this term in the back of your mind as we go through the next couple weeks of NTI. As a refresher, we had been talking about the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. So just to review, the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, even if segregated schools were otherwise equal in quality. So once the Supreme Court issued this ruling, it meant that states could no longer make laws saying that there had to be separate schools for white students and for black students. As we are looking at this issue, there's some key vocabulary that's pretty straightforward, but I just wanted to point out the difference between these words before we went any further. So segregation is when people are separated. So in this case, that would be when you have separate schools for black students and white students. So i.e. black schools and white schools. Integration is the opposite, so when people are not separated, and that would mean schools with both black and white students together, like we thankfully have today. And then you're also going to hear this term desegregation, and that just means the process of making once segregated schools into integrated schools. And so to use that in a sentence, the process of desegregating schools in Little Rock was difficult, and we're going to learn about how and why that was difficult in the coming weeks. But I do want to introduce you guys to some key people, places, ideas, and events in this video so that you guys can understand why desegregating schools in Little Rock was difficult. Key place is Little Rock, Arkansas, which is right here on the map. So we're up here in Kentucky, so not too far from Louisville itself. And within Little Rock, they had Central High School, which was the all-white high school, and then they had Dunbar High School, which was the all-black high school. So you'll hear those school names throughout the next couple weeks frequently. These students who are known as the Little Rock Nine are pictured here, and they were the 9 black students who were handpicked by the Little Rock School Board to integrate Central High School. So I'll just briefly introduce you to each of them quickly. So up here we have Minnie Brown. Then the second person in the top column, the second person in the top column, this is Elizabeth Eckford, who goes through this very traumatic experience on the first day of school that you guys will learn about in tomorrow's lesson. Last person on this top row is Ernest Green, and he was the only senior the first year, and he was actually the first black graduate from Central High School. In the second row, you have Thelma Mothershed, Mabella Patillo, and she wrote a memoir about her experiences that we'll read some excerpts from, and Gloria Ray. And then on the bottom row, you have Terrence Roberts, Thomas Jefferson, and Carlotta Walls. Helping these students is Daisy Bates, who is right here. This is her with the Little Rock Nine. So Daisy Bates and other members of the NAACP provided students with support as they work to integrate Central High School. So Daisy Bates would make sure that they had transportation, to make sure that they weren't having any issues, would check in with the students a lot. And then in addition to that, her and other members of the NAACP would provide legal support to the students as this integration in Little Rock unfortunately results in several court orders and lawsuits that you guys will learn about. Another key individual is Orville Faubus, and he's the governor of Arkansas. So as the governor, Faubus is the executive of the state government, and he controls something called the Arkansas National Guard, which I'm going to show you in a second, but the Arkansas National Guard are important in this situation. Just a little bit of a background on Faubus. He is the governor. He was elected by kind of acting moderate, and he not outwardly supportive of the civil rights movement, but he was more supportive than a lot of other southern state leaders, and that won him a lot of support within the Black community. But he just barely won the election because he supported a lot of civil rights stuff kind of half-heartedly. That actually lost him a lot of votes from white people in Arkansas, who, not all of them, but most of them were against integration in general. So throughout this time, he is very supportive of the white population of Arkansas that does not feel that the federal government should be able to make Little Rock integrate its public schools. Now, I just mentioned the Arkansas National Guard, and you'll see them right back here. Here's an Arkansas National Guard man. But the National Guard is basically like a state military force that the governors are in charge of. So, for example, in Kentucky, we have a National Guard, and currently Governor Beshear is using the National Guard to help with some COVID-19 relief efforts. But throughout time in the United States, there have been National Guards for each of the 50 states, and the governors do control the National Guard, and they can deploy them whenever they think it's necessary for the safety of their citizens in their states. So Faubus actually, on the first day of school that the Little Rock Nine are supposed to go to school at Central High School, he deploys the National Guard there because there were people from Arkansas and all around the country really that were coming to protest the integration of this school. And so these are like white people that kind of created a mob situation outside of the school on the first day. As Faubus is learning about this, he deploys the Arkansas National Guard, and he actually told them to prevent students from entering school. So this right here in the center is poor Elizabeth Eckford, who got split up from the others, and she goes through this horrible experience on the first day of school that you guys are going to learn about later. But just keep in mind that the National Guard, even though it says national in the name, it's kind of confusing. It's actually like Arkansas military almost that Faubus uses to prevent school integration. Then on the national side, you have Dwight D. Eisenhower is the president of the United States at this time. And as part of his duty to enforce laws, he should oversee that schools are integrated after the Brown decision across the country. And at first, Eisenhower kind of leaves this more to the states, but then as situations are developing, like the one you just saw in that picture in several states, he starts getting criticisms from many people within the civil rights movement and other citizens in general of, hey, these states aren't actually integrating their schools like the Brown decision said that they should have to. And people started to want him to take more of a solid stance and do more to make sure that southern states did actually integrate their schools. And he eventually had to order the 101st Division of the U.S. military to escort the students into school. So that's what you see in this picture here. So as you can tell, these are the U.S. military, the 101st Airborne Division. which were like an elite force known as the Screaming Eagles. And Eisenhower ordered them to Arkansas to actually escort the students and stay with them throughout the school day to make sure that they could integrate the school and that they were safe in the process of doing that. It gets a little confusing because you have both federal troops and the Arkansas National Guard, and their uniforms kind of look similar. So it's easy to kind of mix them up. But just keep in mind, if you hear federal troops or the 101st Airborne Division or the Screaming Eagles, those are Eisenhower's like national, they're part of the military. And so he uses them to protect the students and to make sure that they are able to integrate Central High School. And then if you hear from the Arkansas National Guard, those are FOBUS's like state military, and he uses them to prevent integration. So just kind of keep that distinction in mind and think about that when you see different videos and photos. As I said at the beginning, this is all an example of federalism, so please keep that in the back of your mind this week. Again, federalism is a division of power between the state and national government, and I want you to imagine it like a game of tug-of-war between the states and the national governments, who will use different parts of the Constitution to argue that they should have certain power over various areas. So on one side, you have southern states who are against integration, arguing that they had the right to not integrate public schools, and they use the 10th Amendment to support their argument that they had the right not to integrate public schools if they didn't want to, because the 10th Amendment says that anything not listed in the Constitution as a power of the federal government is a power of the states, and the Constitution doesn't say anything about public education. So a lot of southern state governors argue they have the right to not integrate public schools if they feel like it is not in the interest of their citizens or in the wants of their citizens. And then on the other side, you have Eisenhower over here, and he's using the Brown decision, the Supremacy Clause, and the 14th Amendment to argue that it's the federal duty to enforce the Brown decision, and that if southern states are going to make laws that are for segregation in public schools or that prevent integration of public schools, that it is the federal government's responsibility to go to those states and enforce the Brown decision. And so these two men, they play tug-of-war over this issue. Thankfully, spoiler alert, in the end, Eisenhower does win, as you guys are probably aware of by the fact that we have all kinds of beautiful faces of all different colors in our public schools today. But we're going to look at how Eisenhower did win that battle and kind of what was discussed in between. So I just wanted to kind of explain that stuff to you guys so you would have a good frame of reference as you're going through the next couple weeks of lessons. That's all I really have for you guys today. So before I jump off here, I just want to say that I miss you guys. I'm sorry we're not going to be back in school this year, but you guys will have to come visit me next year because I'm really upset that we all didn't get like our last day of class together. So I miss you guys. You guys are still doing a great work with your NTI stuff, and I'm so proud of you all. Please don't hesitate to reach out or ask me questions. I'm happy to help in any way I can. But I'm going to hop off here, so I hope you guys have a wonderful week.